Alone, worn and out. Perhaps she had longed to have someone in her old age. It was a new thing to Anne to have that feeling of dull self-reproach, that consciousness of failure unmixed with anger. Anger had obliterated any consciousness of failure towards Bryce. Now, old Willie's bequest and the inescapable thoughts it brought with it held a mirror of self-analysis up to her. She could not look around it, nor walk away from it, but must stare and stare at the reflection of herself. And there was another thing that she had to think about. Warren's questions, his reference to his father. Willie was dead, Bryce had gone out of her life, but the boy remained. Not 4 years in the world, already he was asking questions she could not answer. He would grow, would question further. Was she going to fail her son as she had failed those others? Oh yes, Willie had indeed had someone to take care 198 off her in her old age. Her longings and her poor little pride had been justified at the end. But Anne could take to herself no credit for that. Willie dead, she could admit her own failure. If things had fallen out differently, she would have said, when word came of the old woman's death, the poor old soul. When word came of the bequest, she would have said, how funny. What on earth shall I do with it? It was only by chance, and because of her own need, not Willow's, that she had stood by at the end. So, now that the time had come when she was free to leave, she had to pause for a while, try to read her compass, to take her bearings, for there were strange seas ahead. She had been drifting. Where was she now? What was her position? What worth had this place she had thought she had won to? This security she thought her own toil had achieved for her spirit? This freedom from the bond of obligation? There was Bryce. She had never believed that Bryce was dead. Gradually, she found herself thinking more and more about Bryce, without anger, without bitterness. If all life led on to something, what was waiting for her? What was she going to meet? Above all, what was Warren going to meet, and how was she going to help him meet it? Could she escape that slow, on-sweeping purpose pervading everything? That warp that ran through the whole fabric of life? To some nature, life is a decomposing thing. To some, a stimulus. To others, a slow melting pot, terrible in its persistency, yet all the while, in its crucible melting away the baser 199 in elements, that the purer may emerge. In some natures, a gold of the spirit is the residuum, made a thing of itself only after the fires of life have had their way with it, worked it and fused and refined it. Anne's physical freedom had come at last, only to thrust her into thought, core of the crucible. But even yet, she was not undergoing its intensest heat. It was too early to begin work in the garden. The fields were drying slowly that year, the season pausing, farmers waiting with impatient acceptance of the inevitable. Many hours during the winter, she had passed with Kent before his fireside or in Miss Willow's parlor, or tramping over the rutted roads. He had played to her and loaned her books. On a day when the sun was as warm as in June, she and Warren started. Now look here, Anne Warren, I take your pay, 'cause I got to, and to make you feel better. But when you talk about gratitude, well, that's your business, not mine. Folks that do things for gratitude do them from vanity. I hope I ain't vain. Maybe I am, but I try not to be. Our Lord wasn't vain when he healed the leper and raised up the dead. She dropped a plateful of rings into the smoking fat. Anne's eyes were smarting. Willie, you make me ashamed, she murmured. That's good, said Miss Willie. What can I do? Don't you see how helpless I am? Well, since you ask, there's one thing you can do. You can think of the folks around here as folks, not lumps of clay. That's what you've been doing. But you listen to me, Anne Warren. There's all sorts of clay. I'm not saying you're our sort. Some clay's good for bricks, and some for fine china. There's some that 1 on 226 ain't good for a thing, as far as I know, but to keep things from growing. Still and all, the Almighty used clay. They didn't look about him for anything better. He just finished making a new world too, all spick and span, with flowers and waters and snakes and everything. Might have taken his pick, but he found clay plenty good enough. There, the last, want a hot one, and took the donut, went out of doors to a chair under the apple tree. The old woman's talk had startled her, notwithstanding a lurking sense of shame and deserved admonishment. Her thoughts were not of herself. Where had old Willie learned her philosophy? Surely philosophy or wisdom did not accrue to one. It was no thistle seed, to be blown white-winged on the wind, to germinate wherever it fell, on rock or roadside or clay. Willie's life had been bare, so bare, and thought brought back, in one of those oddly photographic flashes with which the mind visualizes a long train of circumstance in a single picture, the coming of Willie to her father's house and events leading up to it. There had been many women, called, in the small-town phraseology, housekeepers. Between the time of her mother's death and the coming of Willie, Professor Warren's continuous advertisements for help were the joke and the pity of his neighbors. Anne could not remember her mother, but she remembered the succession of housekeepers, not as individuals, but as people who got in her way, who tried to restrain her, on whom she used all her childish 127 arts of retaliation and torment, until they left in despair or dudgeon. She remembered the day when Miss Willie came, a small, gray-clad person with a carpet bag that instantly claimed the child's attention and afterward became an object of admiration. There was no other like it in town, and she used to bribe Alice into docility and even occasionally Nicky by a sight of it in the attic. Sometimes Nicky held out for the further bribe of being allowed to march up and down the length of the attic with it in her hands, while Alice and Anne would chant, "Tramp, tramp, tramp, the boys are marching." Alice always wanted to sing "Onward Christian Soldiers," but Nicky and Anne agreed that a carpet bag was not an appropriate implement for Christian soldiers. Besides, one couldn't step as quickly to that tune as to the other. But that first day, Anne and eyed Miss Willie solemnly, biding her time. She had no doubt that this new one would be like the others, easy to vanquish. "Her name's Willie," she told her father that night at the supper table. The professor, harassed, poor man, as he always was when confronted with his daughter after a long day at the high school, weakly remonstrated. "That's what she said it was," Anne insisted. "She told me to call her that." "But surely," the professor protested weakly, looking to the end of the table for help. Miss Willie was all placidity. "She can, if she's a mind to," said she. 128. The good man's frown of helpless perplexity had not lessened. "But surely there must be another name, a name more." I know," Miss Willie had answered tranquilly. "Folks do seem to find it kind of queer, but that's what I was Christ Ned. After my pardoi, not Wilhelmina nor anything like that, just plain Willie. Then I think your last name, it don't make much difference. That's Willis." Anne was still solemn, her eyes demurely downcast. Willis. She'd know how to deal with that. But her hopes and intentions met their small Waterloo no later than that same night. The campaign was short and decisive. "I get to bed by myself," she told Willie. But Willie replied, "Not this night, you don't. Not till I get those snarls out on your hair anyway. I like it this way. I don't like to have anybody else comb my hair. Liking ain't getting. You stand still. I won't hurt any more than I got to. But those snarls come out." So Miss Willie remained, saw her married, and a year or two later watched, while the professor's life ebbed, while Anne and Bryce were hurrying towards the town Anne had left with so little reluctance. Then she had come back to Heathville. That was old Willie's life, as Anne knew it. Where and how had wisdom philosophy? Come to her. That evening Anne asked, "Willie, have you ever, at 129, lived anywhere else but here and with Father and me?" Miss Willie was knitting. "No," she said. "Never was much of a mover." Anne smiled. "How'd you happen to come to us?" "I wanted it." "My freedom," said Willie. "Freedom? Yes. I guess maybe most folks do, sooner or later. My aunt was a good woman. This was her house. She took me in when Ma died, but I wanted my freedom. So when I saw your pa's advertisement, I packed up and went. Then I come back again. The house had been shut up for years. My land, it was dirty. I don't know when I've had such a good time as I did cleaning it up. And the garden, all weeds. When I was a girl, this place used to seem kind of little, shut off in the hills, the way it is and all. There didn't seem to be anything to do. Now, dear me, sirs, the days ain't half long enough. I must help you more," Anne said. Miss Willie looked over her spectacles, went on with her knitting, changing a needle. "I wasn't hinting," said she. "I like the work. Funny. It's just what my aunt used to do when I was a girl. Maybe the difference is now it's my own. I don't know. Only I'm free now. I guess folks get to know about that when they're old. I had a squirrel once. It lived in a cage for years. Went round and round on a wheel. Thing at one side of the cage. I thought, poor thing, it's old. It ain't got long to live. I'll give it its freedom before it dies." So I set the cage on the porch and opened 130th door. The squirrel went out like a flash and ran up a tree. But the next day, it was back in its cage again, making the wheel go round and round. There were days when the heat was less, when midsummer quietude brooded upon the hills, and fields exhaled the odors of growing things, and woods exuded their realm. Winter stored moisture to the summons of the wind across the tree tops. Long mornings when Anne listlessly washed the dishes and made the beds and dusted, while old Willie toiled outside. And long afternoons when Anne walked, sometimes on the road, through the glen, sometimes to the doctor's prescribed hilltop and back, sometimes, as her strength grew, to farther pastures. To those walks, she was driven and lured. Driven by her desire to get away from the house, from Willa's chatter, from her own thoughts, and lured as a child goes looking for fairies by a feeling that never quite came to consciousness that somewhere, sometime, she would find something, some balm of the spirit, some response or enlightenment. Sometimes she walked in desperation, taking with her the burden of her rebellion. This place to be buried here. She must get away. Anywhere. But at least the long walks gave her dreamless sleep. In August, Nikki came for a Sunday. Alice and the children were at the seashore. Nikki was in a quiet mood. They spent the long afternoon under the apple tree. "You look at me as though I were one of your 131 cases," Anne said, aware of Veronica's covert inspection. "Do I?" Nikki calmly responded. "Hey, sir, wasn't thinking about you at all, if you want to know. I was thinking about myself and Ambrose." "Hey, be glad to know that." Nikki was lounging back, one knee over the other, arms under her head. "You know, Anne, this mess of yours, it's made me, like Ambrose, rather better. Because I've proved your contention that marriage is a failure. Made you think you are right in your eternal argument with Ambrose. Oh no, I always knew I was. But Ambrose has been so mad about it. He was always so darn meek before. I rather prefer Ambrose mad. The role of the strong man, the cave man." Anne laughed. "Even you can't escape the feminine complex, Nick. The longing to cling, to have something to cling to." Nikki chuckled. "There's only one George," she said cryptically. "And time hasn't finished with George yet, nor with Alice. One thing I've noticed about clinging vines, feminine and otherwise. They rot the stump they cling to. If it isn't a stump, they smother it, keep it from fruiting. And if by any chance the old tree's too strong for them, the vine is no good. There you are. Anne sat up. Well, I have failed. I admit that. Or to put it the other way, maybe the right way, Bryce failed. But just the same, Nikki, it does not have to 132 be failure. There ought to be a sense of duty, if nothing more. That would bind. Bryce failed in that. I never did. Didn't you? But anyway, this rot about duty. Oh, I know it has its uses. It helps along the propagation of the race. But when you think what it does to poor old humanity. No, old girl. If I should marry, I'd have to be jolly well certain that there'd be something more left after 10 years than mere duty. That salt would have no savor for me, as it hasn't for Bryce. Apparently, I have stopped thinking about Bryce. I'd prefer to stop talking about him. All right, after I've given you a message from Ambrose. They've done all they can to trace Bryce. Ambrose asked me to say that he cannot collect on the life insurance for you. Not evidence enough. He wants to know if you'd like to sell the house. He'd buy it himself on a quitclaim deed. Nobody else would, without Bryce's signature. How Ambrose must have loved offering me charity, said Anne, bitterly. Tell him I thank him beyond words. But I have enough. Between 40 and 50 a month. Nikki sat up too. Good Lord, Anne. Is that all? What'll you do? She cried. Anne bit her lip, made a helpless gesture with her hands. Yet, gradually, during the weeks she had been in Heathville, her sense of values had been readjusting 133 themselves. Here there was all but nothing to spend money for. Why, you're richer than anybody in this whole village, Miss Willie had said. Unless it's that Ken man and the doctor. Even the minister only gets $200 a year, and he's well off. $40 a month, my land. She was watching the old woman at work in her garden one day, squatting between the rows, weeding. Why do you work so for those things? Stupid things like beets and carrots? She asked. They're for winter. The cabbages too, and potatoes, of course. But why do you grow them at all? Why not buy them? Miss Willie looked up. I just told you. They are for winter. What else will we eat? But there's a store. A store? My goodness, child. Folks around here don't buy things like them at the store. It don't keep 'em anyway. But even if it did, who'd buy what they grow in the garden? Yet, even then, Anne did not dream of the ways and means, the contrivings and savings that went into life in the village, Miss Willow's and that of her neighbor. Their meals were plain enough. Anne observed, without comment, that whatever was bought or brought in from the garden was eaten, sooner or later, to the last mouthful, by human or cat or fowl. Nothing was wasted. 134 she had noticed the clothes worn by the women, and there was the affair of Miss Willow's best bonnet, donned only for Sundays. The monthly church supper. I do think it becomes me, said Willie complacently. I've had it 6 years going on 7. It's just as good as new. Then there was the boy Beryllium. The name had amused her. She repeated it, smiling, one evening, and then Miss Willie said, yes, it's real high sounding. He's the 7. Miss Wells, she wanted a girl, all the rest being boys. Had her heart set on calling it Dora. When it come, well, she was always romantic, Mrs. Wells was, and she never had much of a chance to break out. I guess it did her some good to call him Beryllium. During the midsummer heat, Anne protested against the old woman's eternal work in the garden. She would pay Beryllium to hoe. But it's 20 cents an hour, Miss Willie cried. My goodness, child, 20 cents for 1 hour, and sugar the price it is. In the early coolness of September, her walks became longer. The heaviness of her languor was less, Yet one day, when she reached the crest of the hill and sat down in the shade of a weather-worn maple, she knew that she was tired, not with that terrible weight of the spirit which had shadowed her for so long, borne her down, but as a workman is tired at noon and sits down, grateful aye, that his body may refresh itself with food and rest and cessation from toil. From where she sat, no 135 habitation of man was to be seen. The world seemed a place empty of animate life, for even the cattle were below in the marsh, out of sight. Haze lay on the hills, merging them into the sky. The patches of sweet fern were already darkening to ripeness, and the rock at her side was warm to the touch. Asters and goldenrod glowed in the sunlight. The sumac was red. Beyond, down the valley, here and there in the woods, a white birch shone, slender, fastidious, seeming to tread its way daintily forward to the eye's finding, like a conscious beauty at a ball. Upon the meadows cloud shadows lingered, and under the maple was shade, quiet and shade. Different. Why were things different today? Many times she had looked on the same scene, inwardly shrunk from its emptiness. But this quietude in the drenching sunlight and the cool shade, this was not emptiness. Peace. Oh, yes, it was a sort of peace. But something was going on in it, through it. There was life. Working. Not hurrying, not crowding, silent, but working on and on. Trees gnarled by winter storms, rocks laid bare and carved by frost and ice. A land worn rugged and seamed from its age-long battle, but still with vitality and the germ of things to be, things that would die to grow again, grow and become lovely with a perpetual renewing. And even after fruition and harvest, through winter to spring, on and on, ever to be renewed. Life. Suddenly, there under the sheltering boughs of this old tree, there facing the sunlight. 136. She put her hand to her heart. Another heart within her was beating. Another life had stirred. For an hour she sat there, her arms clasping her knees, her head bowed above them. A great stillness pervaded her. Life going on, herself part of it, needed. That was it, needed. Fitting in with it, necessary to its scheme, a part of its plan, a utensil of service and servant as well. And for so long, she had thought there was no plan at all, or if there were, that its parts were hopelessly jumbled. Strange, if one were a part, or were needed, then there was something to do, something to wait for, to hope for. At last, she stood up and looked again over the drowsy loveliness of the world. Slowly, she went down the hill and placidly. There was nothing to hurry for, no need now to walk and walk so that she could not think. When she came in sight of the spire and houses of Heathville, even those looked different, less poor and sordid, friendlier. Miss Willie was not in the kitchen. There came a faint echo of hammering from the direction of the henhouse, and Anne took her way towards it. The downy chicks that had scratched under the rhubarb had long since grown into frisky birds, large enough to be promoted to the privilege of roosting with their mothers and aunts in the henhouse. Miss Willie was there now, mysteriously wielding a hammer. "What on earth are you doing?" Anne asked from the doorway. "Carpentering. You?" Miss Willie turned, her mouth as full of nails as a seamstress of pins. "I'm making a walk for that T-137 poor blind chicken," said she. She took the nails from between her lips and pointed with pride to a contrivance she had achieved, a board slanting from floor to roost, with occasional cross pieces on it. "There, look at that. Ain't that grand? Don't know why I didn't think of it before. That poor chicken has been trying its level best to jump on the roost every night and bumping its head on the board and all. Must have felt like a body knocking at the gate and St. Peter away on vacation. But what good is that queer-looking board? Can't you see, child? Use your eyes. That's a walk. I've been coming out here every night to put that poor thing on its roost. Come winter and I'd get good and tired of it. Besides, think of its feelings. Now I'll just train it to peck around and find its own walk and climb up. Get on the roost like its folks, without having to be helped all the time. Nobody likes to be helped all the time. Anne's face softened a little. And I would have killed that blind chicken long ago, she said thoughtfully. Well then I wouldn't. Lots of folks with 2 eyes in their head see less than that chicken and have no more sense. It's got a right to live. 3. When autumn came, Beryllium set up a stove in the front parlor. That room, which until Anne's arrival had been kept for the most part closed, a ceremonial E138 elegance of which Miss Willie was very proud. The house itself had none of the dignity of the doctors and some of the other older ones. Apparently it represented the imaginative efflorescence of some country builder of half a century before, limited in means and method. There were but 2 sizable rooms on the first floor, parlor and kitchen. Miss Willie's bedroom opened it off from the kitchen, little more than a large cupboard, its space amply filled with bed and pine bureau, while back of the kitchen, longer than the house itself, was the shed where wood was stored, and a miscellany of oddments that were mysteries to Anne. She had pleaded to have the wall-papered fireboard taken away from the parlor. An open fire would have made of the room a different place. But Miss Willie looked troubled. "But how'd we heat your bedroom?" she asked. "Mine's real nice and warm opening off from the kitchen like it does. But if the stovepipe don't run up through yours, child, how'll we heat it?" For the first time, Anne understood the purpose of the round hole in her floor that had seemed so mysterious. The hole through which she could see one red rose on the parlor carpet. She had supposed that it was left for the purpose of being able to look down upon callers. It amused her to be brought face to face with so elemental a problem as heating a house. It had startled her to find that there was no bathroom, surprised her that the water in the kitchen came from a pump, not from a faucet. Yet those things did not 139 concern her, and in the matter of the fireplace, she yielded. In time, Beryllium set up a stove. When she first saw Willie come staggering in with an armful of wood, she protested. It was not woman's work. Beryllium must do it. But thereafter, mysteriously, the fire in the stove seemed to feed itself, and in the evenings old Willie would drop wearily into her chair and nod. Vaguely, Anne wondered why she was so tired, now that the garden work was over, the small crops harvested and stored away in the cellar. Yet, after all, the endless monotony of the days were enough to weary anyone. Morning drudgery, night, morning again, and more drudgery. That summed up life in Heathville, as far as she could discern. With the autumn rains, her restlessness returned, and times of rebellion, now not against the coming of the child, but at the aridity she was living through. Alice wrote insistently that she should come to stay with her and George, later to go to a hospital. Anne refused less because of reluctance to accept Alice's bounty than because she was unwilling to encounter old friends, old acquaintances, to have to meet their pity or amusement. Now, she would not let her mind dwell upon the difficulties of the future, because that would be bad for the child. This was a time when she could do nothing but wait, and this was as good a place as any. Later, of course, she must find some means of making a real livelihood. Live in Heathville? Her child? Hers? Of course she would find some means of escaping that. During the radiant days of October, she frequently 140 drove with the doctor on his rounds, in a small battered car that possessed a personality of its own. She liked the doctor. He was country, queer, as he described himself, but his was the only mind she had encountered in Heathville that could think or express its thoughts. As to that, she believed that Beryllium's mother and the other women she had met did not think at all, but lived by instinct, or went about their tasks like trained animals, except that for them there was no reward of caress or tidbit. Purposeless, stupid, they seemed to her. Dr. Severance was neither. He called his car. Sally, named her after an old mare I had. Died in the harness as I hoped to. One thing she does, almost as well as old Sally did. She gets me there. Yet apparently Sally did not always hold that intention. More than once, the doctor had to dismount and do mysterious things to Sally, almost at times, as Anne once told him, laughing, amounting to major operations. Once Sally's temperament overcame her not far from a small brown cottage set back in the woods. After some minutes of futile ministrations on the doctor's PR, Sally still remained where she had stopped, soundless and motionless. Anne had stepped down and was walking along the road through the yellow leaves. As she repassed the cottage, a man came out and, after a look towards the car beyond, smiled at Anne. She had become used by now to the friendly custom in the country of taking acquaintanceship for granted. They walked back to the car together. Vibe 141 doctor, hands on hip, glared in mock ferociousness at the other man. Come to try one of your faith cures on her, I suppose, he growled. The other man chuckled. Might try it on you, Tom, remarked. You're a little excited, aren't you? Well, I've worked on the blame thing an hour at least. She won't go, spluttered the doctor. That's like you medical men. You fiddle and tinker and dose, and think you've done all of it. You're always forgetting there's something else. The doctor snorted. I've heard you say that before. Look here, you Rufus. You use faith on Sally and get her to start, and I'll take up some stock in that faith of yours. The man called Rufus had moved to the side of the car. His hair was quite white, his shoulders were stooped, and life had worn marks on his face. But he bore the indefinable stamp of the intellectual. Anne decided at once that he was not a native of Heathville. He seemed to smile easily, or else the smile never quite left his eyes. Now he bent towards the driving wheel of the car, peering as though from near sightedness, and stood up to grin at the doctor. I've long since discovered, as I've told you before, us. You say, Tom, quite as you say, that there is some eternal spark that moves things. There must be a spark, Tom, somewhere. In the case of your Sally, why not turn on your spark, Tom, and see? 142, the doctor's mouth opened. A blank look came over his face, but he too came up to the side of the car. He reached over, touched a small lever, and instantly Sally responded with rattles and tremblings. Hell, said the doctor. Anne laughed aloud, long and gaily as she had not laughed in months. I beg your pardon, the doctor muttered. Ladies present. But Anne's laugh still rang out, and the man called Rufus was chuckling with her. The doctor was red. He climbed into the car. Who was that? Asked Anne, when they had passed the brown house with the woods at its back. Old fool, said the doctor. Anne bit her lip. Well, but who else? The doctor permitted himself to smile. Name's Kent, though you're likely to hear him called the fellow that bought the Carscaden place. Nobody knew where he came from, nor who he was. Had to call him something, so the title sort of got itself hung on to him. Folks thought, I believe, he was some relation of the Carscadens, who hadn't lived there for a generation. Does he live there alone? Lord, no. Got a Jap servant for one thing, and a wife, and there's always a house full of lame ducks, human and otherwise. You'll have to go there and make his acquaintance someday. He's a great friend of mine, really. But Sally, don't like him. Oh, said Anne. Because of his principles, I suppose. The doctor sniffed. Something like that, said he. 143 Key A. Another day they were driving along together, slowly, in the lace, like shade of the woods. Anne had been saying little. These drives with the doctor brought a measure of soothing to her spirit. By this time, the brilliance of the autumn foliage was past, lying in golden tribute on the earth that had given it life. Now and again the little car would stop before some house while the doctor went inane, leaving Anne musing outside. Good people, those, the old man said as he drove away from one little house. "And so poor," said Anne. "I saw 4 or 5 children there in that tiny house." The doctor considered a moment. "In one sense," he said slowly, thinking it out, "poverty is having the consciousness of poverty. Those people have never had more. They have no consciousness of being poor. They are not poor. Oh, but the fact remains that they are. Look at the house. Think of the lack of advantages. And what are those advantages? But surely one knows. No. What are they? Really? Comprehensively? Can you say, Mrs. Dennison? In the sense in which you mean, all a matter of comparison, aren't they? Well, comparison with what? With something a man has not got and thinks he wants, or thinks he ought to have, or thinks somebody else has gotten ahead of him by possessing. What's the end of that sort of thinking? 144-2. But not to think, not to want, not to aspire. I wasn't talking of aspirations, but weren't you? The doctor shook his head. Doc, you'll have to take that up with Rufus someday, that queer man. Yes, he's queer. Old fool, as I said. Not that he's old as he looks, but he is queer, though he's got a lot of sound sense in him too. He's thought things out. You'll have to know Rufus. If he has thought out some sort of philosophy like the one you've been propounding, it's greatly to his credit, but it doesn't affect the real question of poverty, does it? Doesn't it? Well, you'll see. But let me tell you this, Mrs. Dennison, the normal man is never a poor man. Perhaps that accounts for so few being normal. So many are poor. I don't mean it that way. You know I don't. I mean that the normal man cannot be poor, because he has all there is that's worth. Wow. Because being normal about sums up to having a good digestion, doing a day's work, getting a little happiness and giving some. Get that into life, and you got about all there is in the ultimate analysis. I hear a doctor talking, Anne commented, and added, "Your friend back there suggested one more element." He mentioned a spark. 145, the doctor looked down at her sideways, pursing his lips. Said he. Her thoughts went back again and again to that conversation. Was that all? Must she endure and find nothing more than that? Health and work, it summed up to, for happiness was only a fleeting illusion. She saw no riches in the doctor's circle. Poverty was not merely having no money, and she shrank from poverty for herself and the child. Thinness of joy, meagerness. No, that should not be. The thought set her pacing restlessly up and down the small, overheated room on an evening when the rain beat against the windows. It was Sunday, and Willie observed the day by going to church in the morning, whatever the weather, and by having their dinner at 2 o'clock instead of at noon. The displaced meal hour set the day awry, except for that there seemed to be no change from other days. Willie was forever busy at something. "My goodness, child, that lamp's smoking," she said when she came into the room. She took the low rocking chair by the table, the catbuster jumping into her lap. "What? I've been thinking," she went on. "When I was a child, they used to call Sunday the Lord's Day. That's funny now, ain't it? Even old Willie's chatter was better than the dreary persistence of the rain." "Funny?" Anne asked, smiling a little. "Why? As if every day isn't the Lord's Day," said Willie, her faded eyes looking at Anne, looking away again. 146, I just guess he sees to that. He's got us all in his hand every day, Sundays and all, and every day, come day go day, he keeps right on working and looking out for us." Anne smiled a little. She had heard a good deal of Willa's primitive theologue during the past months. "Not but what I know Sundays by right set apart for us humans," Willie went on. "A good thing it is, too. I've heard folks talk hard things about men, and about women, too. That does one way on weekdays, and another on Sundays. Booty, I say, land. It's better to behave decent one day of the week than never at all, poor critters." And if that's being a hypocrite, well, it's better to be a hypocrite one day than seven. Anne laughed aloud. Miss Willie stroked Buster, who purred like a tea kettle. Another funny thing is how people's mistakes get mixed up with their sins in folks' minds. I don't doubt the Lord sees which is which. I don't doubt he's capable of handling them both. But I often think folks try too hard to do the untangling themselves. I don't know, but I'm going on 73. I've come to the conclusion we'd be better off if we just leave it all to the Lord. That's a comfortable doctrine, my dear, Anne remarked. But if you'd let it work out, wouldn't it be a little like giving the kitten the work basket to play with? Miss Willie looked at her over the top of her spectacles. 147, that's just what the good Lord has done, said she. Given us the work basket to play with. And a real good snarl we make out of it, most of us. But having given us a work basket apiece, as you might say, he don't expect the kittens to take on themselves to say who's to blame for the tangles. That's where we don't follow the Lord's way. There's no question of that, Anne agreed. No dot. And that's what you're doing, Anne Warren. You and Bryce had one work basket between you. Somehow it's got into an awful mess. So you're scratching at Bryce, thinking it's his fault. I don't want to talk about Bryce, I dare say, but I'm going to talk about him whenever I've a mind to. Right now, what I gotta say is, that baby that's coming has got a right to his father, and his father has got a right to him. Bryce Haas? Gone. They have tried to find him. He's gone. Yes, maybe. But you're forgetting that he's the baby's father. I know. I don't say they haven't done all they could do to get hold of Bryce, but they ought to do more than they can. There ain't anything impossible after you get it done. The baby belongs to him. Anne jumped to her feet. No, he's mine. All mine. He's the Lord's, Anne Warren. And the Lord's fixed it so's he had to have father and mother both. 148. You're setting yourself up in the Lord's place when you pass judgment on Bryce. He has set judgment upon himself. He has gone. If he never sees his son, that will be judgment. He deserves it. I am not sorry. No, I'm not sorry. For after a time of weakness, when she scarcely realized the small creature at her side, after other days of watching him with wonder, and days of sitting in the sunny window behind the geraniums with the baby asleep in a basket nearby, Anne said to Miss Willie, "His name is Warren." Willie looked at her. Anne saw protest in the look, but she smiled, serenely, securely. "His name is Warren," she repeated. Said old Willie. "Well, after your poor dear father, well, you're his mother. I suppose you got a right to call him what you're a mind to." "I am his mother. Oh, I am," Anne agreed, lifting the baby, snuggling him up to her face. She knew well enough what Willie implied. For this was Bryce's child, like Bryce in every small feature, like him even in the soft, reddish hair on his head. But her whole being protested against what Willie wanted. Another Bryce. All the more reason why he should not bear Bryce's name. No one should have a share in him, Bryce least of all. She denied Bryce's share in him, even to herself. He was hers. All hers, miraculously flesh of her flesh, hers to love. He should be 149 more and more hers. Often during that marvelous spring and summer, the same jealous thought returned to her. The child flourished and grew, a sunny baby. His first smile was for Willie. "Look at that now," the old woman cried. "Who'd have thought it? He knows me. He knows his old Willie." Anne snatched the baby up to her breast. She had watched for that first smile, longed for it, wanted it for herself. But a moment afterwards, she was ashamed. Willie was the slave of them both, toiling and loving with a devotion as absolute as that of the nun whose life is centered in the cross on the altar and the red light before it, who spends her nights on her knees and would starve herself, castigate herself, readily, give up her body and soul, and her life bit by bit that her Lord might perceive and accept her adoration. Willie would come in 12 times during the day to look at the child. Her face became rapt when his tiny fingers curled about one of hers. "To think this should happen to me," she said more than once. "To think of your baby being right here in my house, where I can see him and all." Then she would trot off to her work again, trotting more slowly and falteringly as the months passed. Anne, absorbed in the child, took it as a matter of course that things were done for them both. She did not observe that Willie's hours of work were longer than they had ever been. One day in the spring, she 150 eyes, the old woman spading the garden, and remonstrated. "I can do it," said Willie. "I like to do it." "Nonsense," said Anne. "Doridium can do it in half the time. I'll go up the hill after supper and tell him to come tomorrow. Now look here, Anne Warren, I won't have you wasting your money that way. You got it to save." Anne laughed a little. "Save out of what I have? What's the use? It would never amount to anything. You got plenty to save something out of if you don't go frittering it away. You gotta save for Warren's education." "Land," said Doridium's mother, when she dropped in one morning while the baby was having his bath by the kitchen stove. "Mine never had all those fixins. I just washed them off when they were dirty and kept them well fed and let them cry and let them sleep. A baby ain't only a baby when all's said and done." Anne said nothing. That, doubtless, was true as far as it went. But to compare the young Warren with these country children, as well compare grain, sacks, and silk. There were things about her child that she had never observed in others. She never tired of pondering on all his small perfections. Her state was not peace, but absorption. The rest of the world was shut out, thrust aside, while she tended her baby and watched the developing wondrousness of him. For the first time in her life, she was absorbed in something besides herself, yet this was inextricably herself. Her ET 151 own has nothing else had ever been. As his individuality developed, she hugged that thought to her more and more. Even while she adored them and gloried in them, she was jealous of the will and impulses that came from somewhere within his small self. For when young Warren wanted to sleep or to stay awake, he did so. When he was hungry, he made his want known vociferously. He loved the warm water about his plump little body and yelled when he was lifted out of it. He hated to have his nose and his ears touched, and to Cece Valley said so. Here was something apart from his mother, not hers at all, needs and preferences not springing from her, the will of another creature to which she must yield, which she resented and feared and adored. "Got a will of his own," said Willie one day when the two of them had tried in vain for an hour or more to get him to sleep. When their patience was threadbare, both vanquished by the utter helplessness of the adult before a baby's unreasoned persistence, the boy had abruptly stopped crying, looked into the old woman's face, smiled divinely, and dropped into slumber. She laid him down on the sofa. "Just wanted to make us understand once for all that he wouldn't go to sleep till he got good and ready," said she, and bent over the child. "He's his mother's own boy," she said, with the fatuous sentimentality of the parent who has just been worsted in a battle with her offspring and finds balm in her tenderness, pride in the strength of the victor. 152, Miss Willie sniffed. "He is, and he isn't," said she. She had no sooner dropped into the rocking chair than Buster jumped into her lap. "Some of him's yours, and some is his father's. You needn't look at me that way, Anne Warren. And some of him belongs to himself, and a good part's the Lord's. What the Lord means him to be, you can't tell much about. It's got to come out. I've always noticed that the Lord does a lot of mixing of his stuffs before he finishes a job, same as I do with my bread. And when he's got a thing turned out at last, it's crammed full of most everything, good and bad, sense, and foolishness. It works pretty well, but it needs a whole lot of oiling to keep it going. The baby's like that. There's a lot in that baby that's going to come out. Do what you will. You gotta help him get started, but I guess when you think he's all finished, it'll be just about the time he's beginning to run with his own machinery. And if you poke your hand into it, you'll likely get pinched. He belongs to himself, Anne, and don't you forget that. Not that you're likely to get much of a chance to. Anne smiled. Willie was not a mother. Willie could not know. There is no chart which tells how a mother's time goes. Anne did not know how the months went. In the autumn, Alice and George stopped for an hour. They had been motoring, and Alice was anxious to get back to the children. "Darling, are you comfortable here? Why won't you come back with us?" Alice asked. 153. Anne laughed. "No, I'm not comfortable, as you know comfort, Alice. But this is the place for me until Wani is a little older. Of course, I am not going to live here forever. When he is old enough to play with other children, I shall have to take him away from here. There will be the question of school, too. I shall have to learn how to make money." They were alone under the apple tree. George had driven to the store for gasoline. For a moment, Alice looked off, vaguely, at a distant hilltop where already a maple gleamed yellow. Then, without turning to Anne, she asked, "Did you hear that Rani is married?" "I supposed would be. In the spring, wasn't it?" Alice shook her head. "No, just lately. Not to that girl he was engaged to. He treated that nice girl so badly. Kept putting things off. He has married a woman who was divorced. He's so different from Georgie. One wouldn't think they could be brothers." Winter came and went by, and in earliest spring, before the glaze ice was gone, Miss Willie fell. Anne came down one morning to find the kitchen cold. She called, opened the door of the old woman's bedroom. Yes. Then, throwing a shawl about her, she went out of doors. At the door of the hen house she found her, huddled, eyes dim with pain. "No, don't you lift me," said Willie, her lips blue, her face gray in the sunlight. "Something's broke." Anne sped across the road for the doctor and on for Dorillium, who came running back with his father and 154 a brother or two. They carried old Willie into the bedroom off the kitchen, and for an hour while young Warren shrieked, unregarded Anne stood by. When the worst of it was over, Miss Willie's lips quivered to a smile. Anne followed the doctor out of doors. She was shaken and trembling. It was the first time she had ever seen torture administered that healing might come. "No, she's not likely to die," the doctor told her. "Oh, Dave. Of course she has worked pretty hard, but it's amazing how much vitality there is in her sort. I've known bones to knit even at her age. But with a broken hip, well, she may get around some after a time." After a time. Anne looked at him, pale. He patted her shoulder. "Don't worry too much, Mrs. Dennison," he told her. "Whatever happens, you can comfort yourself with one thing. It means a lot to Miss Willie to know you are here. I shall never forget the light in her face the day she told me her widowed niece had come to take care of her in her old age. They so dread being a burden, these people. And they dread even more having to be taken care of by strangers, maybe to go on the town. To take care of her. That brave lie told to shield Anne's pride. She went on back to the kitchen. To take care of her. Bit by bit, Anne learned what that meant, to take care of someone. Day by day, she learned what it had meant that old Willie had taken care of herself and the boy. 155 things. Unimagined things. Things vaguely known about, but never realized, had to be done. And not by someone else whom she could dismiss from her thoughts with pay. Elemental things that she had always taken for granted. The fire in the kitchen stove would not keep burning unless it were fed with some regularity. After a week, that stove seemed to Anne like some ravenous maw that was always yawning, always devouring, never to be satisfied. There were 22 steps from the woodpile at the end of the shed, with a step up and a step down each way. 22 steps to bring in coal or wood that Miss Willie, at 74, had trod how many times a day? There was food to be cooked, food that mysteriously scorched or came from the stove as mysteriously hard. Water, the pump over the kitchen sink the only means of getting it. How had old Willie ever carried all those pails and pitchers of water upstairs and down again for Anne's needs and Warren's? And she had always thought of water and food and fire quite simply as things that existed like air and sunlight, made for man's use, and they're waiting, simply, infallibly there. Then there was time. Hitherto, time had been divided into a few broad parts: bedtime and rising time, breakfast and luncheon and dinner time, or, at Miss Will's, dinner and supper time. Now there were many bewildering subdivisions, and one had to hasten to meet them before their requirements or demands or whatever they were used for slipped over into another con 156 off the strange subdivisions, disastrously. Time to get up. Oh yes, but time also to make the fire, time to get it to going, time to get the stove hot, and the breakfast cooked. Time for young Warren's increasing needs, while in her consciousness was always the fact that Miss Willie lay, patient, waiting, perhaps suffering. There were hens and the chicks to be fed, then a rushing for dinner, and in between, where there was not room to crowd a single second's endeavor, a whole multitude of tasks that must somehow be got through. Cleaning and washing. What those things did to her back, so much younger than Willie's. It's awful. You having to do everything, Miss Willie said to her one day when she brought the boy into the room all fresh and rosy from his bath. She had got up at 5 that morning, but then GS were still waiting. Yet she looked down at Willie and laughed. It is, isn't it? Because I'm such a duffer at it, Willikin. You don't know. Miss Willie did not laugh with her. Her lips trembled. But if you wasn't here, Anne, maybe I'd have to go on the town. Anne put the boy on the floor. He was beginning to creep about and sat on the side of the bed. Willie, she said, something is happening to me. I don't know what it is, but I think I was never so happy in my life, nor so disgusted with myself. I do hate to see you lying there, but I think perhaps your breaking your funny old bones was just your last eat. Fine sacrifice for me. I think 157, but that was too much for old Willie. Her eyes struck dim fire. Now look here, Annie Warren, said she, with the first return of her old spirit that she had shown since her fall. If you think the Lord's put me here so's you can get hold of a mite of sense, you're mistaken. That's putting too much on the Lord. I slipped on the ice because I wasn't looking out. That's what did it. My own fault. But I do say it's high time you knew how to do things. Not that I should want you to tire yourself out. And, my goodness, quick, look at that child. He'll be on the stove in a minute. Anne flew. There were days, a while later, when she got up at 4, when to stay in bed would have been sheer unwarrantable luxury, though her body still ached for rest, and she told herself that she could not go through with the work ahead of her. Yet she arose, and the day's work caught her up, whirled her on with it, herself not the force that accomplished, but the means, the mere tool of that force. When spring reluctantly gave way to summer, people in Heathville hastily made their gardens. It was not safe to plant earlier lest the tender green shoots be nipped by late frost, nor later lest the first hot spell of June wither them. Memorial Day, that's the right time to plant, said old Deacon Bassett, who lived up the road. You ain't likely to get caught either going or coming. Derilium had done the plowing, the spading, the 158 leveling. Anne had supposed that Derilium would do all the rest. She had never felt interested in gardening, and now her time was too full to contemplate added work, out of doors. But she sat at the kitchen table one night, with pencil and paper after paying. Beryllium, her pocket, book open. What remained of its contents spread out before her. There had to be extra milk now, quarts of it, for young Warren. Oranges, too, that now had become not the inevitable breakfasting fruit, but a daily expense of 5 cents, 10 cents, a staggering total each month. The boy was beginning to walk. Delicate shoes she sent to town for wore out in a few weeks. Old Willie had always done their washing. That Anne was incapable of, and it had to be paid for. Moreover, she had discovered the extreme meagerness of the old woman's supply of bedding and towels, and had bought more. Pity, she had not thought of bringing some from that house whose contents she had never wanted to see again. The people who had rented it at first had departed. The next tenants had wanted it unfurnished, and she had insisted that everything should be sent to the auction rooms. Everything. She wanted nothing, no reminders. They brought a small fraction of what they had cost. At old Willie's command, for it was more than suggestion, the little sum had been deposited in a savings bank to be used for the boy's education. That could not be touched. With herself as housekeeper, more was spent than under old Willie's close management for food and fuel. Even kerosene had to be bought oftener. And 159. Now loomed the question of the garden. Anne counted her money, tried to estimate the hours during the summer that she would need beryllium, added up what that would cost, deducted. It could not be done. She spoke of it to Willie the next day. "I've decided that we want to have a garden this year, dear," said she. "I'm no gardener. You know that. We'll just do without." For a moment the old woman lay without looking at Anne, without speaking. Her face against the pillow was wrinkled, pallid. Her age might have been beyond computing, like the Sphinx. And as silently as the Sphinx, she might have been pondering the proposition implied in Anne's words. Then she spoke. "What do we eat?" she asked. "Oh, anything, everything," Anne said lightly, even while an inner sense warned her that the question was not a light one. "There's always something to eat, isn't there?" "Well, what?" Willie persisted. "There is no question as to rementing as the one which puts its solution on thee." Questioner. Old Willie lay looking impassively at a crack in the wall, but Anne looked at Willie. "There's always something to eat, isn't there?" she had asked. But was there? Food I know. Food, the elemental, primal, ultimate necessity. Was it indeed? Always there. She thought of her pocket, book, her sheets of figuring. The thing faced her, simply, starkly, naked, stripped of everything, as hideous and uncompromising as a skeleton. Was food always 160 thee there? What would they eat? Where would it come from? It was breath-taking, bewildering. She busied herself again and again with her pencil and paper, then consulted beryllium. Something, some remote shame or pride, forbade her from talking to Willie. That old woman lying there, who had met this problem so many years, now so helpless, probably thinking, perhaps worrying. No, if she had the thing to go through with, she would do it alone, for beryllium did not count as a person except in the sense of being a workman of sorts, and of having to be paid. "What you want to buy seeds for?" he asked, when she asked him as casually as she could what she would need to buy. "To plant in the garden," said she, sternly. She was always suspecting that beryllium held her in secret amusement and scorn, as those countrymen do who know a few things beyond the scope of someone they confront, and believe their knowledge surpasses all of the others. But the boy was honestly puzzled. "Yeah, what you want to buy 'em for? Why don't you plant what you got? What I have? Sure, she's got 'em saved up, ain't she? Everybody saves 'em up for next year." So, after all, she spoke to Willie again about the garden, went to the place where Willie had stored the saved seeds, in jars and small packets tied about with bits of string. Economy had never held anything of U-161 in beauty for Anne, but when she brought out those seeds, fruit of an old woman's toil, so carefully cured and saved that the soil might be fruitful again the next year. Something gripped at her throat. Here was a poignant significance that rose up at her. Here, too, was the germ of a new perception. The garden was made and tended that they might have something to eat. As simple as that. But there was more in it than that stark necessity. It was the child of other gardens. In the little packets of saved seeds there was not only harvest, but a link with gardens of other summers, with summers to come, as old Willa's toil was linked with the labor of the ages, as her own would be. On and on, the treadmill, unending, however one ached. And after she had talked with Willie as to methods and means, she was confronted with her stupendous ignorance of what seemed so simple, what was indeed so elemental. "Why, you just scrape out a row and put 'em into it," said Willie. "Then you cover 'em up." "With what?" she asked, for she had seen newspapers carefully spread over some of the old woman's tender cuttings and wondered if that were a right to be observed with everything else. "Good land, child. Ain't you got any sense at all? You cover 'em up with dirt and pat 'em. All down, of course." Anne laughed a little. "Do they have to be patted? Shall I pull up the blankets and hear them say their prayers too?" 162, Willie sniffed. "You don't have to blaspheme just because you're so ignorant," said she, "though lots of folks do. Yes, they do have to be patted, or else trod on. The dirt's got to touch 'em, or else they won't sprout. And the dirt's got to be fine, not all lumps. Sakes alive, I wish I could get out on this bed. That's sheer pride and jealousy. Willie, you think I can't make this garden, and you want to do it yourself," Anne laughed. But when she confronted the actual task, she did not laugh. Before, she felt herself potentially able to cope with it. It must be quite simple, like driving a Ford, because people of such inferior intelligence mastered it. Of course, it was not fit work for her, and she had not a minute to spare for it. But it must be easy enough, since even an old woman like W. Ely had accomplished it. Her only difficulty would be in finding time. So one morning she got up at 4, just as dawn was flushing on the western hills, and betook herself to the place Beryllium had raked at such a cost. "Scrape out a row," Willie had said, "and make the dirt fine. Easy," until her shoulders ached with the weight of the hoe. Her row turned out to be a wandering path of varying depth. She dropped in the seeds. Willie had said there were enough in the bundle for a whole row, but they mysteriously gave out before the row was half filled. She considered the problem, carefully picked out seeds enough for the rest of the row. Then came the affair of making the dirt fine to cover them with. She could not. It was heavy with dew, refused at 163 crumble, persisted in becoming a tough clay substance under her hands. She had been out 2 hours. Warren's cries could be heard. She was aching and angry. She had not achieved one single row in this miserable garden, and the piece of smooth land stretched before her into a leering expanse as broad as an ocean. It was the first time she had ever discovered that to work with nature, one must use nature's time, wait on her mood. When she went to the garden again, later in the day, she was amazed to find that the earth crumbled easily enough. Thereafter, she rose at the same early hour, but worked at other things until the garden was ready. A few weeks later, again directed by one of Deacon Bassett's pronouncements, she was working there with a hoe, the baby happy and noisy, playing in the dirt, his attention absorbed by filling a tin can with a hole in the bottom, watching the soil sift out and filling the can again. Someone spoke to him over the fence. Anne looked up and nodded, but Warren deserted his game and promptly performed the acrobatic feat of making himself into a small pyramid, bracing his feet until they were steady by resting his hands on the ground, his inevitable method of arising. Then he toddled and tumbled towards Beryllium. "What's them things for?" Beryllium presently asked. He had come near, holding Warren's hand. Anne sat back wearily, but with a sense of triumph too. "Them things were an achievement," and she took pride in making them well, first by scraping the 164 earth up with a hoe, then rounding it off with her hands. "They're the hills for the corn, of course," said she. "This is the week for corn. What should they be?" She rather enjoyed snubbing beryllium. "I don't know," said the boy. "Never saw nothing like 'em before. And you've lived in the country all your life. I'm surprised at you. Mr. Bassett says it's much better to plant corn in hills than in rows. It doesn't blow over as easily." Beryllium's slow grin was a thing to see. "Here, you give me that." "Oh," said he, and forsook Warren's hand so abruptly that the baby sat down with a soft thud. Beryllium scraped out a shallow hole. "Now that," said he, "is a hill. You put your corn in there on top. Then you cover it over. Then you stomp on it. That's the way to plant corn. Them things you made, they ain't hills. They're Mount Ararats." "My goodness," Anne murmured meekly. "A hill upside down." But the incident gave her a new feeling of humility, of helplessness, of respect. Humility. That she, Anne Dennison, should cope so badly with such primitive affairs. Helplessness, because there seemed so many difficulties, however absurd and small. Respect for these country people, even for beryllium, that they could perform with ease. What she found so intricate. Long before the last row was planted, and walked to 165 eon, there were green things beginning to show in the first ones. By that time, she had formed quite a friendship with the deacon, a stern, gray old man. Often after supper, he would come down the road to inspect her labors. Sometimes, when a new problem came up, she would tuck Warren under her arm and run to Bassett's house for advice. "Yes," she complacently told him one evening, "they're coming along." That was a phrase he used. She had unconsciously adopted it. "And I do think Miss W.L.'s seeds are wonderful. Ever so many more come up than I've planted, it seems to me." Bassett rubbed his chin. He shaved on Sundays only. "Yes, well, maybe," said he. "But I shouldn't be surprised if a good many of those green shoots are weeds. I suppose you ain't got around to weeding yet." That, when she had begun to tell herself that her labors were all but over, she thought of her aching arms, of tasks waiting indoors, thought yearningly of beryllium. But old Willie had managed without the boy. So would she. Many an evening after she had washed the day's grime from Warren and got him to sleep, and laundered some of his small garments, and made the kitchen neat after supper, she worked on her knees between the rows, weeding until it was too dark to see. Yet do what she might, there were disasters. "Seems like our beet greens is terrible slow this year," said Miss Willie. "You got 'em in time, too. It's funny what a difference there is in seasons." 166. No need to tell her that all the young beets had been carefully, laboriously, back-breakingly weeded up. And such futile things anyway. Beet greens. To get the best of one, merely by being. It shamed her. That difficulty of coping with little things that she had scarcely realized existed, except as insignificant parts of a whole that ordered itself. She had always been willing to battle with what she conceived to be big things, those that meant conflict with people. There was exhilaration in that. It got one somewhere. But this daily, hurrying conflict with nature and the bare routine of living was bewildering. It entangled her in all sorts of complicated trivialities, as though it could make any difference, for example, whether one planted corn in rows or in holes or on small Mount Ararats. To find that it did make a difference, that one had to discover and yield to the preferences of corn and of beans, was bewildering. Bewildering. But slowly out of bewilderment, there came a feeling of conducting a campaign. She was not going to let herself be conquered by a vegetable garden. It grew in importance, became a battleground. Eventually victorious, she had such a feeling of triumph and achievement as not even the arrival of Warren had given her. Winnie, that small featured replica of Bryce. The garden, with all its failures and oddities, not in the least like Miss Willa's neat, straight-road one, was a thing of her own creating, wrought by her own labor, by the veritable sweat of her brow and the grime of her hands and the ache of her body. Something 167 that contributed to the very foundation of life. Something, quite simply, to eat. It was as said. Though she had caused earth or air or water to come into existence, she had caused food to be. She did not regard her performance, nor its results, as beautiful, nor as clever, nor as amusing, nor as something bound up with the future, like Wani. She had brought something that was elemental out of nothingness. She had become creative of that which was the very basis of existence. 5. So the summer passed in toil. No time for thoughts, nor for thought. No time, really, for anything, with so much to be done, so little that could be left undone. Hens, Anne discovered, could be as clamorous as babies. When a prideful, clucking absurdity emerged from a hidden nest with a brood of chicks, she could have crushed a lot of them. They were hated, but they were important, for they were food. And after a day or two, their very helplessness and dependency captured her. She was indignant and sorrowful when one fell prey to Buster's rapaciousness. Miss Willie frequently asked after her flowers. There weeds among them that Anne told herself could not go unregarded, whatever happened. The peonies bloomed so generously. How could she let their brave beauty smother in weeds? After a summer rain, the hollyhocks lay on the ground. There was no time for it, but she must find stakes, tie them up. 168 by midsummer, Wani was toddling everywhere. He possessed an ingenuity for getting into mischief beyond anything his mother had ever encountered. If he were silent or out of sight for too long, she had to drop everything, hunt for him. And his clothes, those small, costly shoes that wore out so soon, the rompers that had to be fresh every morning. There were days when his bath was no more than a hastwise sponging away of grime before he was put to sleep. Nights when she was so weary that she dropped on her bed without undressing, to wake in the dawn with a crowding sense of things waiting to be done, in a panic of fear lest she had overslept. Everything was in the present. The future was something she had no time to think about. Work, 2 to care for, 3 to provide for, hurriedly, rather chaotically. Winter came, when she had thought there would be more time. But again there were stoves, lamps, sewing. The child had outgrown the first baby coat Alice had sent, and contrived to make him another out of an old skirt of her own. It had no air of elegance. She laughed when she dressed him in it. Pity, said Warren, smoothing his bulging front. Not so. Very pretty, old man, Anne laughed. But it will keep you warm. Pretty is as pretty does, said old Willie. And Anne, goodness, I hope not. If his looks had to be measured by his behavior, 2 years before she could not have tolerated that 169 garment. Now she could laugh at it, was even rather proud of it. But she did not for more than a moment think of the change in herself. There was something else waiting to be done. Orderliness she had not begun to learn. There were neighbor women who came to see Miss Willie, bringing gifts of pies and donuts and tastes of jelly and jam and pickles. Seeing Miss Willie's enjoyment of the delicacies, Anne remembered that the old woman had always managed to put up some of her own. Now, the pantry shelves held none. She had never thought of making any. Where had Willie found time to do it? How did those other women, busy mothers of families, find time? Even the mere thought of their dish washing staggered Anne's imagination, now that she knew how mysteriously dishes piled up for only 3. And there was their mending, their cooking, there was washing. Yet those overworked women found time to come to Miss Willa's and visit sometimes for an hour or more. Anne found herself listening to their talk. It was no longer of trivialities beyond or beneath her scope and her interest. Things become vital. They had been vague, dull, toiling creatures without imagination, without grace, uninteresting. Now they emerged into separate entities, personalities with feeling and impulses which she recognized, more skilled and counter, experienced than herself in things of first importance. There was so much that they knew, and that she did not, and things they achieved daily, as a matter of course, simply and neatly, that staggered her efforts and ingenuity 170 perform and they left her worn with fatigue after trying. The working classes. She remembered that she used to think of the working classes in the old days with something akin to disgust. She had never been able to understand Nikki's interest in them, nor how she had been able to endure daily contact with them. Either they toiled with an impenetrable, ineffectual, stolid indifference, or they disagreeably or violently protested against their lot, deviously trying to better it at the cost of the comfort of people who were more fortunate than themselves. They were unreasonably envious, and their morals were as sordid as their way of living. She had always felt injured and angry when one of her maids had asked for extra time off. He remembered her. Amused scorn when they spent their earnings for some foolish finery to be worn on 1 or 2 afternoons of the week. These women who dropped in to see Willie were toilers in a labor unending. She knew about that now. As far as she could perceive, theirs was a labor without result or reward, just a grind, day after day, year after year. Now she knew that they were not sunk in a dull state of mental and spiritual stagnation. They were not clamorously trying to better their lot at the expense of others. Apparently, they shattered no more of the 10 Commandments than anyone else did. Sometimes she wondered what secret revolts of the soul might be theirs, or whether they had souls at all in the sense of possessing a well-spring of feeling. And though 171 and aspiration, they concerned themselves with things she had never supposed required thought, or were bound up with feeling or led to aspiration, but indubitably aspiration and feeling and thought played a part in their lives. First they had been shy with her. 1 or 2 had told her hesitatingly how fine it was for Miss Willie to have her there. They thought of her as the niece from the city who went about, always dressed up, and sat around while Miss Willie waited on her. Now they found her aproned, busy, and there was always the child to talk about. Anne found herself listening with absorbed interest to tales of other children's illnesses. She was not bored when Mrs. Ware told how her Julia had broken her collarbone, nor when Mrs. Beeman told how her twins in one winter had measles and chickenpox and whooping cough. Alternately, SOs we were no sooner getting out of one thing with Elizabeth than we come down with the same thing with Florence. And by the time Florence was better, Elizabeth had started on something else. Those things were not trivial. They were not disgusting. They were not unpleasant diseases that troublesome children persisted in having, so that one wondered how mothers endured them. They were dangers that lurked for Wani. Those women were mothers. So was she. She took Wani to the Christmas tree at the church. His round-eyed wonder was a revelation, something that pierced to her heart. Mrs. Beeman gave him an orange. When he held it in both hands, stared at it, 172, it was not an orange, but a symbol, a mystery. He had seen it taken from a box under the tree. Therefore, it was endued with beauties and wonders beyond all other oranges. Anne, looking up, met Mrs. Beeman's glance, her tolerant, understanding smile. A few days thereafter, Mrs. Wells ran down the road, bearing a plate wrapped up in a napkin. Hot rolls. I thought maybe that'd go good for supper, said she. Land, I should think so, old Willie said. We ain't had any home-made bread since I don't know when. The visitor looked at Anne. Why, you don't buy all your bread, do you? I can't make it, Anne said. But it costs so much at the store. The next day, Anne bundled up Wani and walked up the road to the Bassetts. The children of that house had long ago gone away. The old couple were alone. and Mrs. Bassett was known as the best housekeeper in Heathville, eternally busy. "Will you teach me how to make bread?" Anne asked, and could see the flattered look in the old woman's eyes. Her first loaves were an achievement that gave her a satisfaction, scarcely less than her conquest of the garden. "What's that I smell?" Old Willie called out from the bedroom. "You ain't ever trying to make bread, child. You'll just waste the flour." 173. "Not I," Anne declared, coming in with a freshly baked loaf turned out on a towel. "Look at that, Willie. When I think of the money we've spent at that store for bread." Old Willie's lips quivered. "I got to get out on this bed," said she. "You can't do all the work yourself, and taking on more all the time." Anne put the loaf down, came and stood near the bed. "Willie," she said, "it's the strangest thing. No matter how much more I find to do, I always seem to find time to do it in. And stranger still, I rather like doing it. It makes me feel so important." Gradually, the women who had been coming to see Miss Willie lingered to chat with Anne. Recipes were given that had to be explained. Flower seeds were brought in small bits of brown paper, and about their flowers, odd sentiments lingered. Odd to Anne because at first they seemed so trivial. "That's impatience," said one, presenting a slim sprig of green planted in a can from which the label had been removed. "Impatience, though some folks call it patience. Either way, it's the truth, for it's always in a hurry to bloom, and it blooms all the time." There were slips of geranium too, and a small prickly cactus. Anne thought of Alice's masses of flowers, of those she herself had always managed to buy for the dining room, and of lilacs and orchids and tulips that fell. But these little, struggling things in pots and cans had personality, identity. They 174 were a nuisance at first, because she was forever forgetting to water them. But when she discovered them drooping, and watched for them to revive, they assumed an importance beyond reason. They were gifts. She could not let them die. Then they bloomed. By the time spring came again, Miss Willie was hobbling about with a crutch and a cane. The crutch Anne had to buy. That month she began to do their washing. The cane was brought out of a chest in the attic. "My poor grandfather's cane," said Miss Willie. "You can see his name on the silver band. Poor man. I'm afraid he drank a good deal. My grandmother married again. But after all, I'm sure there's nothing like young love, my dear. I've been thinking, when he grows up." So Willie was almost herself once more, though she was never again able to do active work. She could sit in the window behind the flowers and sew and knit stockings for Warren. It lifted a good deal from Anne to have her watch the boy, whose capacity for mischief increased every day. "What that child does think up," said Willie. He had climbed on a chair when no one was looking and dropped soap into a stew Anne was making for dinner. They discovered it when he danced up and down, clapping his hands and shouting, "Oh, look at the bubbles! Look at the bubbles on the stove! Pretty bubbles!" One he makes, "Ooh, pretty bubbles." 175 then, from the chair where his mother had forcefully deposited him, he howled miserably. "Don't like one is bubbles. Bad mums don't like one is bubbles." Anne looked dolefully at Willie. "Stew enough for 2 days. Oh dear, all that good meat." Miss Willie's placidity was not ruffled. "He was only just doing what you do yourself, and what most folks do," said she. "I never put soap in the stew," Anne protested, laughing ruefully. "I ain't so sure about that. What I meant was he only sees things from where he stands. You got to make allowances for that." In the course of the months, Anne had achieved some measure of orderliness. Work did not crowd as much as before. She found herself looking forward with unsuspected eagerness to the time when the garden could be planted. It was good to see the snows melting, good to see the brown earth emerging and drying, good to bring in pussy willows, and to wander with Warren through the moist woods, to find hepaticas, even good to hear the hylas again. One night, when the others were asleep, she stood at her window and looked out. The moon was high. Earth and sky were inherent parts of the same beauty, hesitant, translucent. In the moonlight, even the familiar garden and roads and fields were an effect of foggy, luminous unreality. The world slept, yet it was breathing and dreaming. It called her to go forth into its hesitant loveliness, to walk 176 penetrate and become a part of its dream. The boy was sleeping with his face buried in his pillow, the red curls on his neck damp and sweet. He could be trusted not to wake. She crept down the stairs. The doors were never locked. It was strange to be walking along the road in this strange light. Even the shadows were softer, melting and merging into the earth. On and on she walked, slowly, through a world creating itself anew, through our sweet woods, between fields fragrant, with the moist breath of night, past a marsh where the hylas piped, little pans, plaintive, luring, singing of joys that might be or joys to come. Abruptly, where the road wound through a stretch of woods, she stopped dead. Something moved there. Once, fear would have held her, but she had come to know how needless fear was in that faraway countryside. "I hope I have not frightened you," a voice asked. Strange to hear again a voice of cultivation, words enunciated with careless precision. Suddenly she remembered. Not far beyond was the house of the man who had come out to the doctor's car on the day it had stalled. The man the doctor termed old fool. "Not exactly," she said quietly. "I'm afraid I have walked rather far, rather than think. I meant to." He had come nearer. He was hatless, and she remembered how white his hair had looked that day, and realized that its whiteness gave him that strange appearance now in the dim light. Yes, one has to come out on a night like this, HL 177 said. "I have an idea that the real purpose of the moon is to keep the balance even. The sun works, the moon calms and blesses. We need both work and calm to keep the balance true." Anne smiled faintly. How odd he was to speak like that, without preface, to a stranger. "There are various other things one needs, are there not?" she suggested, falling into his mood. "Yes. Oh yes. But they all come into the two categories. Work, not necessarily what one does not love or enjoy, but work, occupation, and calm, ease and alternate labor. What else is there?" They had fallen into step. After a moment she said, "I think you are laughing at me." He grasped at a bough that projected across the road, its buds just beginning to open, snapped it off, the sound of its breaking distinct in the night stillness. "Forgive me, not at you. I should not have said that, nor felt it. It's only fair that life should give us the obvious things, make us go searching for the others. So there is something else." She knew he turned to look at her. "You came out to find it, didn't you? And I came out." They walked on a little. "Does one find, I wonder?" she murmured. They had reached the edge of the woods. Before them a meadow lay flooded with moonlight, gleaming 178 like a sea becalmed. They stood still, held by its beauty. "I don't know," he said presently. "But if one may still search, still come out, into this. It's beautiful," she said softly. "But there's no answer there." "I'm not so sure. Not that it matters, the answer. It's the search, the fact that one can come out, that one wants to. Is that enough?" Unconsciously, they spoke almost in whispers, as though to speak aloud would be to break the spell of the night. "Not enough, no. But there's always the belief or the hope that there's something to be found. Else one would not come out." "I wonder," she said. "Oh, we all wonder. But we all know it's there." "What?" He waited. "Rhythm, I think. Or call it God." They were silent a moment. Then, without seeming to know she was there, he walked away. "6 the first day," she permitted. "Miss Willie, to go as far as the garden. Anne proudly pointed. "There!" she exclaimed. "Look at that, all ready for the seeds. I did it myself too." Beryllium did nothing but the plowing. One helped, the youngster boasted. 179, not the hoeing. "And raking." "You never did, Anne Warren," old Willie cried. Anne laughed, brushed a hand upward across her damp forehead. "But I did. I'm so proud of it. I call that a good job well done." A letter received from Alice about that time amused her. Alice and George were taking the children to Europe for the summer. Would not Anne use their house while they were gone? The servants would be there, the house going on as usual. There would be the car, and Warren would like the children's playthings, the sandpile, and swing in the yard. There was plenty of room for Miss Willie too. Anne's first thought was, why, I couldn't leave the garden. Then she laughed aloud. But it was quite true. That garden had been conquered the year before. Now it was hers, and she could not tolerate the thought of leaving it. That summer, there were no such mistakes as had baffled her last year, for old Willie looked on and advised. Anne was bending over the washtubs every week, rejoicing in the flapping white things on the line. She was making their bread, and under Willie's direction canning fruits and young tender vegetables in glass jars for winter. Warren, with his increased capacity for getting out of sight and into mischief, was even more care than before. Yet she had an elated consciousness of living. One July day when the heat was so intense that Willie had not ventured out of doors, Anne was hanging 180 out clothes, grateful that the weekly washing was done. The old woman came to the kitchen door. "Winnie with you?" she called. Anne put the last clothespin in place, took up her basket. "That monkey, has he slipped off again? I'll have to go look for him." She went, calling, and presently Warren came running towards her, his face mottled with crimson, torn with briars, and both his closed fists dripping red. But he was smiling angelically. "I brought you some too, Mums," said he, opening his hands and holding them up to her. He had been tightly grasping the raspberries. "He ought to be spanked," said Miss Willie. Anne looked over the child's head and smiled. He was standing in one of the tubs getting scoured, his dimpled body rising from the suds in which he was infinitely more interested than in cleanliness. "Will you do the spanking?" she asked. Miss Willie looked at her over her spectacles, said not a word more. That afternoon the child was sleepy. His forehead was hot. "Don't want to go out in the garden. Want to stay here?" he said later. And Anne, who was starting the fire for supper, absently agreed. "All right, old man, but don't get in Mother's way." Then she heard a cry from Miss Willie. Another moment, and she was kneeling on the floor, lifting the child to her breast, shrieking. 181. "Stop that. Leave him there. Don't take him up. It's a spasm," she heard Willie say. "He's dying. My baby's dying." "He ain't either. You leave him right there and run for the doctor. I'll get the kettle on. Give me a spoon to put in his mouth. Now run." The little body was stiff. The child's eyes rolled upward. "If the doctor ain't there, get Mrs. Beeman," Willie called after her. She stumbled on the steps, caught herself, raced on. The doctor was not there. Mrs. Beeman turned from the stove, the twins and the other children staring open, mouthed at the frantic woman who had burst in upon them. "My baby! Convulsions, he's dying," Anne panted. Instantly, Mrs. Beeman grasped a steaming tea kettle from the stove and held it towards Anne. "Take that and run," said she. "Here, you Johnny, you carry this pot. Never mind the potatoes in it. They won't do any harm. Now I'll get the mustard. 10 minutes, half an hour." And Winnie was wrapped in a blanket, relaxed, his eyes closed. Mrs. Beeman laughed. "I used to think you used a good many things to bathe him when he was a baby," she said. "But I guess it's the first time he ever had a hot bath with potatoes floating around in the water. 182, Anne was still trembling. If you hadn't come, you saved my boy. Late in August, Nikki came for a week. She watched Anne at first, curiously, making no comment on her varied activities. Human work in the garden was over until time for harvesting. There were hours in the long afternoons when the two could sit in the shade or walk through the woods. Anne, Veronica asked one day, "Do you ever have time to think?" Anne laughed. "Yes, with my hands. I've never seen you look so happy, so satisfied." "Why shouldn't I be?" That, from Nance Dennison. "But you aren't Nance Dennison." Anne leaned forward, her hands dropped beyond her knees. "Oh, yes, I am. Don't you think I am not, Nikki, old girl? I always wanted to do things, my own things, have my own way. Now I'm doing them, reveling in having my own way. Of course I'm happy and satisfied. Oh, well, there always has to be something beyond. Of course I'm not going to stay here forever. That's really what I came about, Nance." Anne looked at her questioningly. "There's a new home for working girls. A sort of hotel, really. But they want to provide something more for the girls than other homes do. They want a hostess, a woman who has 183 been used to things. I can get you the job if you want it. There's Winnie. You could have Winnie with you. The pay isn't bad." Anne stood up, her hands behind her back. There was the tea garden, the house, the hen house, the hills and ripening fields. "Nikki, I can't," she said. "Not while old Willie lives." Nikki lay back, stretched her arms over her head, yawned. "You're growing up, Anne," said she. Afterwards, Anne wondered at herself a little. It was true that a few years before she would have taken the chance without thinking of anyone who stood in the way. If she had heard of some other woman making such a choice, she would have scorned her for it, set her down in the same category into which she had dismissed people like those who were now her neighbors, as being of no her neighbors. Account, bound by their own dullness and stupidity and lack of initiative, without intention, without aspiration. Her mind was still groping. She could not have told what why she had permitted herself to be held by allegiance to old Willie. But, however, vaguely, she was beginning to feel that there was something beyond initiative and aspiration, some established necessary sequence, perhaps even some purpose. Several times, she had encountered the man, kin on Clone 84 to the road or in the store. Once, he had said to Warren, "You come to see me, and I'll show you something." She thought of him as of one who could speak her old language, remembered his odd way of coming abruptly to things that were commonly left unspoken or only touched upon after a word. Preface of intimacy, as though they were common enough to be taken for granted, so much a part of one's habitual thought as to come naturally to any man's lips. Her harvesting work was done for the year. The little place was neat for winter. The pantry shelves were filled. She smiled when she looked at those rows of bright jars. She, Anne Dennison, four-handed. On a day in late September, she took her son by the hand and set forth. Not that Warren permitted himself to be held in leash for long. His legs were sturdy. How she loved them, their curves and dimples and bruises. He would trot ahead of her to kick up the leaves, go foraging into the woods, spring out upon her at the next turn. He howled when he investigated a chestnut. Burr, a moment later, joyously presented her with a spray of asters. Walks with Winnie had their variety. Before they came in sight of the cottage, her ears caught the sound of music. A piano, played rather superbly. She, though tea. In spite of her restraining call, Warren flew to the door, hammered upon it. "I want to see what that noise is. Let me in. I want to see." As she reached the door, it opened, and Kent stood 185 there laughing. He took the child's hand, closed the door behind them, and came down the walk towards Anne. "We've interrupted you," she said with an air of apology. But he shook his head. "No, I was playing to my wife. But she's asleep now. It always quiets her." "I'm sorry. I did not know Mrs. Kent was ill." His face bore a worn look, as of one who had not slept. "Always ill. I am very glad you came to see me. I have been thinking so much, Mr. Kent, of some of the things you said to me that night when I was so wild as to walk in the moonlight." He looked at her questioningly, yet she did not find it difficult to speak simply of what had seemed so simple to him. He nodded. "Ah, yes." Then his manner changed. He looked down at Warren. "How would you like to come into my garden? I could show you something there. There isn't any garden anymore." "We've dug the potatoes," said Warren. "There is always a garden," the man said, laughing. "Come along." John led the way with the boy, talking and answering, for there had to be a good deal of answering, with Warren. "This is a funny garden," said Warren. 186. "You just wait," laughed Kent. "And don't stumble." The path led down sharply, and drew a quick breath when it ended abruptly in a cleared space at the base of the hill. A space perhaps a full 100 yards across, leveled and smooth, the woods closing it in, sunlight drenching it. Only a few bronzed leaves clung to the low-growing oaks against its forested wall. For the rest, it was raked clean, like a house swept and garnished. And that, thought Anne, was what it must be. A house here in the woods, with the sky for its roof. There were borders where even now a late rose or two braved the cold nights. At one side, a long, shallow pool, its banks strengthened with fieldstones, caught a bit of the sky's blue-eyed girl. Just beyond was an arbor, white grape, trellised, and at other places 2 long, low benches of gleaming white. On one of these lay a doll, large as a baby and as daintily dressed, its legs hanging limply over the side. On the floor of the arbor, in a spot of sunlight, a dog lay. It got up when it saw Kent, hobbled joyously towards him on 3 legs. He stooped and patted it. Warren drew back towards his mother. "I never saw a dog like that," he said. "Where's all of him? The rest of him, you mean?" Kent laughed aloud. "Well, once he was caught in a trap. The trap bit off his paw. But there are no other dogs here, you see, so he doesn't realize how different he is. We don't remind him of it." 187. Anne remembered something the doctor had said that first time. A lot of lame ducks. This apparently was one of them. Then she became aware of a face in the depths of the arbor, a form there. "Jenny," Kent called. "You Jenny there. Come out here and say, 'How do' to the lady and the young man I brought to call on you." It was a child. Or surely the laugh came from a girl who was not quite past childhood. A girl of 13 or so, Anne thought, when she haltingly emerged. As she came, she seemed to help herself by the side of the arbor where shade lay deepest. Her face wore that curious aideness of the city child who has long been ill. No you don't," Kent called out, laughing. "Don't you touch that crutch, Jenny." "I ain't. Honest, I ain't, Mr. Kent. It's on the bench." "Then you're cheating. You're holding on to the wall." The girl giggled delightedly, as at some huge joke. "But I got to. Now hear that. I told you to come here. Now then, come along. Come along." She came to the opening of the arbor, bracing herself by a hand on its side. Anne saw that her body was twisted, restricted by some muscular impediment, perhaps a form of paralysis. Jenny was smiling, and Kent shook his head. 188 1. "Do, Jenny. You let go of that door and come out here." "But I can't, Mr. Kent. Honest, I can't." "Come." She took a step or two forward, wavered. Anne would have jumped to her side, but Kent's raised hand warned her back. "Now you see that you can. Come along." A step or two more, and suddenly the girl fell awkwardly, sprawling, laughing. "Gee, ain't he funny?" she cried. Kent helped her up, took her arm and led her to one of the benches. "Now next time, young woman, you'll walk. Tumbling has gone out of fashion. Do you hear?" He warned her. It's a heavenly place, Anne said. A sort of magic garden, as though the fairies had lived here a while, and then forgotten it. Kent nodded. I made it for my wife. We just about live down here. In the summer. You see, she's afraid of the woods, and as they shut in the garden, she's safe here. She's afraid to run away, except by the path, and we can watch that. In spite of herself, Anne stared. Yes, she is like that, Kent said quietly. As I said, it's the reason for our living here. Where we lived before, she was forever running away, slipping past all our vigilance. It wasn't good for her to be constantly watched, and she needed the air. Now, 189, she is happier. She has some freedom, but she is safe. Before the strange revelation, Anne knew nothing to say. Kent went on, as though musing. That doll over there. It is hers. I shall have thee to take it back to the house before she wakes up, or she'll cry for it. She calls it her baby, yet at times, you see, she forgets it. When she is very bad. Yes, she is like that. Presently Anne said, the little girl there. Kent smiled. Oh, Jenny. Yes, we have them here. First one, then another. Jenny will soon be all right. She went on 2 crutches a few months ago. He had indeed shown her something in his garden. Anne was certain of that. His wife liked that. That lame dog, the child Jenny. She thought of their meeting in the moonlight, and his words, not that it matters, the answer. Now, in the light of what he had shown her, those words did not ring true. For what was his search? How much was he seeking? Obviously, the man was not impoverished. He was not held to Heathville by that dumb and stupid allegiance to the soil that she read in the simpler people. Yet there he stayed with a mad wife and a lame dog and children like Jenny did. We have them here. First one, then another. He was not searching, not seeking. He was submitting, letting himself be held. By what? 190 she had been held by old Willie, as Kent was held by his wife. Throughout the winter, the old woman seemed as mentally brisk as ever. My land, she said, one cold Sunday morning. I do wish I could get up the hill to church. Makes me feel downright wicked to be so mad about it. Not that I suppose it's any worse to get mad because you can't go to church than because you can't dance or something, nor any better either. Anne laughed. I don't believe it will be held up against you because you can't go to church, said she. Miss Willie sniffed. I was talking about getting mad, not about going to church, she said. Anne laughed. Well, I'm sorry you can't get to church then. So am I. I do want something awful to see that new bonnet the minister's wife got in the missionary box. Willie, you wicked old woman. You fooled me for years. I thought you went to church to say your prayers. I didn't dream your mind was so set on worldly things. Miss Willie sniffed. I do go to church to say my prayers when I can get there. And if a body's mind wasn't mixed up with worldly things, what would there be to pray about? She demanded. There came a day in April when the sun shone in from Anne's window. All the world wore a fresh morning face after rain. Dressing, she looked out upon the corner 91 familiar scene, now I saw it, unconsciously cherished as the features of a beloved. Then she turned to the bed where Warren, now in his 4th year, lay asleep. He had long since refused to submit to a daytime nap, though after his day's intensive play, he was willing enough to go to bed with the chickens. But no birds could wake him early in the morning. He lay now with his arms and legs outstretched, strong and plump, his firm flesh tanned by sun and weather. He was her life, her blessing. Whenever she saw him like that, a surge of love all but choked her. She bent over him before she left the room. He would sleep for hours longer. She went down quietly, started the kitchen fire as noiselessly as she could, went out to the hens. The morning air was sweet. Good too. Breathe it in. She raised her face in the sunshine. When she went in again, she set the simple breakfast to cooking. There was no sound from Miss S. Willie's room. Strange, for the old woman had not lost her lifelong habit of waking with the dawn. She would wait patiently until Anne could find time to help her dress, but always she called out a morning greeting and softly turned the knob of the bedroom door. The little figure was lying on its side, one hand under a withered cheek. Anne's heart leaped. That stillness and the posture like a child asleep, secure in a mothering presence nearby. She bent over the bed. Miss Willie was indeed asleep, past waking. Presently, Anne went across the road for the doctor. 192 K made his brief examination and stood up, looking at Anne, who was unaware of the tears on her cheeks. Yes, he told her, gently. Yes, she's gone, worn out. That's the best way to go. Finished her work. Sleep at the end of the day, Anne murmured. The doctor nodded. Like David, you remember? Who, after he had served his own generation by the will of God, fell on sleep and was laid with his fathers. What's better than to serve one's own generation? She did that. The doctor turned away. I'll send women to you, he said. From the door, they came, those women. Quietly, reverently they came, not reluctantly to that task from which Anne shrank, but taking it as one of the things to be done, by its very inevitableness, removed from horror. She heard them moving about the room, speaking in low voices behind the closed door. They asked her to heat water, and when she had it ready, one of them said, "Now don't you feel so bad." Her time had come. Beryllium's mother came out to the kitchen. I didn't like to open the bureau without you said so, but I know where the things are. She's had him laid away a long time. She told me about him. Anne helped them find the poor, decent clothes, so plain, so clean. So Willie had thought of her burial, even while she thought so much of living. Death. Anne remembered the day her father died. Willie had 193 been alone with him. She and Bryce had hurried, but arrived too late. She had been a little in awe of T-Hat's silent presence, even afraid. She had cried out to Bryce when strange men with black bags passed the parlor door on the way upstairs. And Bryce had closed the door and put his arms about her, closed the door against her dread. Now there was no Bryce. Hurriedly, she put that memory from her. There was nothing of fear connected with Willie's lying there. Why remember that shielding from that other fear? She had felt no grief for her father. They had never been close together. After he died, she had been sorry that they had never been closer. This was different. Not grief, but something gentler, something more poignant. Or was grief like this? Death like this, quiet passing, seemed scarcely mysterious, but only a part of the inevitable round of things. Now she knew something about that. Round of things. There was winter, a going to sleep, and spring following winter. She thought of Miss Willie's springtime, of the little toiling creature who had wanted her freedom. Had she found freedom now? Or what? For there was spring. You'd better let me take Winnie home with me, said Mrs. Beeman. The twins'll just love looking after him. It ain't good for children to be in the house when there's death. Anne kissed her. If you'll take him for a few hours later, she said. For a day or two I can tell him Miss Willa's asleep in there. So the child played about as usual, whispering when 194T came into the kitchen, tiptoeing past the closed door. Willie was asleep. He understood that, and Anne dwelt on the thought of it. Mrs. Bassett came over the first day, a slender, thin-lipped woman with some sprays of geranium in her hand. Seems like I never get much time to grow flowers, she said, but there's these. Another brought heliotrope, another a basket of crocuses. One came with nasturtiums. Seems real nice to see him this time all year, don't it? She asked with pride. They do real well in my south windows. They come from some seeds she gave me once. At night another came, a great white bloom in her hand, and on her face the look of a votary. My night, bloomin' serious. 'Twan last, but she always come over to see it. The night was due to come out. I want she should have it. On the day when Anne sent Warren to play with the Beeman children, the neighbors gathered solemnly in the parlor, presently to follow Miss Willie, who never had led before. Anne stood by the grave lined with evergreen boughs. There was greenery too, over the mound of fresh earth. "Who did that?" she asked as they came away. "Why, we all did. We always do that for a neighbor." Those women, unimaginative, she had thought them, their lives but one long labor, too barren for sentiment. Yet when the time for sentiment came, they had done that tender service. 195. On the day after the funeral, Warren went into the bedroom, stood looking at the bed. "Where's Auntie?" he asked. "When did she wake up?" "She's gone away. Wani, D. Where she won't have to go to sleep anymore." The child stared at her. "Where's that?" "Ever so far away. Where the spring lives before it comes. Where the baby birds come from, and baby boys and girls before they are born." She had no sooner spoken the words than she was conscious of the fatuity of them. Why should she cheat the child with sentimentality? Why not try to tell him the truth? Why deck it out in inanities? But Warren's eyes were alight and wide open. "Where the fairies live?" he asked. "Perhaps," she said. "I don't know." "Oh well," said Wani. "She won't like it much there. Not without me. I guess she'll come back soon." But a day or two afterwards he came to his mother with quivering lip. "I want Auntie. Why don't she come back? Will you tell her to hurry?" Anne turned her face away. "I want her too, my lamb. But she can't come." "Why can't she come? Has she lost her crutch?" She's lost it." "Can't, Wani. I can't go where she is." "Neither did us. That's sore." "Well, where is she? That's what I want to know. How much theology did one give a child?" "There, 196. Had to be something. What could one say?" She took him in her arms. "Auntie is with her Heavenly Father, my dear. He loves her and needs her. Do you know he does? Theology had its difficulties. I do know. He's my Heavenly Father too. So I know. Just the way you know Mother loves you." When he thought about that, "Have I got one too?" he asked. She kissed his curls. "Of course. We all have. Now run along and play. Maybe you'd like to help feed the chickens?" But a few nights thereafter, while she was making him ready for bed, taking off his stockings and reveling in the fragrance of his hair against her face, he propounded another question. "Mums," he asked, "when am I going to my father?" 7 under old Willa's handkerchiefs in the top drawer of a bureau, they found a folded sheet of paper. "I'm in my right mind and senses. I give my body to the grave and my soul to the Lord. Everything else is to go to my friend, Anne Warren Dennison." There was Willie's cramped signature and the signature of witnesses. "It is no more than right," said Mrs. Wells, who was one of the witnesses, "seeing you come here to take care of her in her old age." Anne said nothing. The date stood out like a pointing 197 finger. Willie had written it more than 5 years before she had come to Heathville, at a time when she thought of the old woman once a year, when the purchase of some gift for Christmas was one of those burdensome trivialities that she got through with as hurriedly as she could. The house was hers, the garden, the few hundreds in the savings bank, because old Willie had loved her, in her own mind, built up about her a little tradition that later expressed itself in the kindly falsehood with which she quieted the curiosity of the neighbors. Come to take care of her in her old age. Perhaps Willie had dreamed of that during the years she had lived.